Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by Cobus van Staden of Wits University in Johannesburg, South Africa. Very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, you and I focus on the China-Africa story. We've been doing it for almost 8 years, and gotta say, generally speaking, when news about China-Africa crosses the lines and the wires and, what do they call it these days? The Google News alert. It's not the top story for the most part. Very, very rarely. And I would say basically every 5 years we get top story billing at the FOCAC, the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation Summits. But in between those big summits, there's not a lot of top billing for the China-Africa story. So it was really a pleasant surprise to see the New York Times Magazine about a couple Sundays ago. Big front page story on China-Africa. And in some ways, it's a milestone because when the New York Times covers this story, it sets a benchmark because the New York Times still to this day is the paper of record in the United States. I know a lot of people will probably disagree with that. But it does set the news tone and the news agenda for big parts of the English-speaking world. So when this story crossed by Brooke Larmer, it was, to me, really quite exciting.
For me too, and it as you said, it indicates that it's coming onto the U.S. radar. So we've seen in the last few months there's increasing calls, frequently from the right-wing press in the U.S., for the Trump administration to pay more attention to the expansion of China and Africa, which is fascinating for me. It's just fascinating for me to see how America discusses this issue, and this was a massive kind of moment, of enjoyment for me.
Is China the world's new colonial power? That was the headline of the May 2nd issue of the New York Times Magazine. It was, again, written by Brooke Larmer, who joins us on the line from Shanghai after kids are in bed. Thank you so much for joining us and making the time in between your various stories and your child care responsibilities. It's been great to have you on the show for the first time.
Thank you, Eric and Cobus.
Now, Brooke, you and I spoke a couple months before you embarked on your journey to Namibia, and we just did a little bit of a casual debrief, and I'd be curious to kind of, hear about what your impressions were of covering this story before you went, because you're not focused on China-Africa studies. You're based in Shanghai, so you've been covering the Chinese world for a very long time, but the China-Africa story was relatively new to you. What surprised you the most from the time from before you went and when you were actually on the ground reporting this story? What was the biggest challenge to your preconceptions?
Well, I guess just to start off, I would like to say that I don't pretend to be an expert in the China-Africa relationship. I also feel like I have traveled around the world and reported from 6 continents, and in each place I've been surprised and pleasantly surprised to meet Chinese workers and engineers in almost every place that you go on Earth. And so I've always been curious about China's impact in the world. And I think one of the reasons I focus so sharply on one small country in Africa is I think, look, this is a ludicrously complex relationship that China has anywhere in the developing world, whether it's Latin America or Africa or Asia. And I had no interest in doing a big, broad survey from 30,000 feet to try to conjure up what this all meant. I was much more interested in, and I generally tend in my reporting to be much more interested in seeing what it looked like and felt like on the ground, and in one specific place. And Namibia is a very small country. It's only 2.5 million people, of vast deserts and open spaces, but it has a wide variety of contact points with China. And I thought that it offered a kind of a small test tube, if you will, for kind of how that relationship felt. And yes, I was, this is something that I was really excited about. In speaking to you, I think I already got a sense for how varied the experience is on the ground. I think a lot of people that look at at China in general, but also when they go into another country, is to see it as one monolith, and that all the state-owned companies and the people that go are all basically the same. And I think what was so interesting to me was to see the variations in experiences of different generations of Chinese immigrants and people who have gone to Africa to work and to join either in projects that are by private enterprise or by state-owned enterprise, as well as by themselves doing as merchants or traders. And I really wanted to evoke a sense of what it was like for the Chinese that were in in this environment, as well as for what it's like for Namibians to feel what this relationship is like with China. So I felt like it offered me a very nice, small enough place where I could actually get my head around it, because it's very complex. But I had a lot of fun reporting it.
So you were speaking to us from Shanghai, and you've obviously spent a lot of time in China. So what was it like for you to go from an experience of being in China, kind of dealing with Chinese systems, to seeing them, as it were, from the outside in Namibia? What did you see in Namibia that you felt, oh, okay, this is very similar to how it would be done in China? And where did you see, oh, this is actually done differently outside of China, even though it's Chinese companies doing it?
Well, I've reported on China outside of China before, and I've done a series of stories on, for example, Chinese seeking education in the United States. And I think one of the kind of consistent things that you see is that a Chinese environment, Chinese, when they're in a company or in a situation abroad, often kind of group together and try to and relate to each other almost exclusively. And I guess I was somewhat surprised to see that this was also replicated in Namibia, where even in places where there are only a few Chinese families in a town, their relationship with the rest of the town was relatively limited. And their entire operation, whether it was a mom and pop shop or something bigger, was usually done through other traders or people from their home province that would also organize for container shipments to come to Namibia to supply their stores, or their social life will also revolve largely around other Chinese families or Chinese workers. So that did not surprise me so much. But I guess I hadn't, and I've traveled to Africa quite a bit. And over the last 3 or 4 years, I've been there maybe 6 or 7 times. I had always been aware of the Chinese relationship there, but what I felt was most interesting to me was to be able to actually sit down with many of these Chinese in different circumstances and to understand how they perceived it. And it wasn't always the same across the board. And I think what I enjoyed about that most was just kind of understanding how they related to their local environment. And some of them were reaching outside of their own community, but for the most part, they were relating to each other and thinking about what this meant for their own country and for their own future in that country. I mean, the younger generation especially is not there for the long term, by and large. They're usually there for shorter term contracts. And their eyes, while they were excited to be in a new place and have these opportunities that were both adventurous and gave them a new view of the world, I think they were still very much fixated in thinking about what this meant for their own country and for their own future in that country.
I'd like to talk a little bit about that access that you got, because that was the most interesting part of the article for me, was that you were able to cross into this world that so many foreign correspondents and foreign journalists struggle with. So you and I spoke before you went. It's a common thing that Cobus and I do, is we help brief journalists to cover stories like this, and they'll call us and they'll say, well, the biggest problem is, how do I actually speak to Chinese people when I'm on the ground? And that was one of the challenges that you and I discussed going in. And I'm just curious how you were able to do that they were able to trust you. You, for example, profiled a young man by the name of Dylan Tung, who was 29 years old. You really got his story, it seemed like. And that's a type of reporting that a lot of journalists are probably quite envious of you, because that's something they would like to do and to tell this story. What did you do to overcome those obstacles that often present themselves when trying to cover the Chinese in Africa?
Well, I think one of the things that I've been pleasantly surprised by is that when you speak Chinese, or speak at least with some fluency, Chinese are often quite interested in speaking to you if you meet them on their level. I had different ways of kind of getting. I did go through official channels, through companies and through the embassy. I eventually got the embassy to respond. I also went through some of the business associations, which are sometimes less eager to have outsiders come in looking into their affairs. but I met some Chinese businessmen on the side, but I also had some lucky encounters. And one was, for example, there's a guy in the story. He's a young man who works for a telecom company in Windhoek, and we just happened to meet at Joe's Beer House, one of the most famous beer houses in Windhoek. And he happened to be there with a group of his colleagues. I was only there meeting someone else, and I just wandered over and talked to them while they were having a goodbye party for their colleague going back to China. And we sat and we got to know each other a little bit. And I followed up with him with this guy Sean Hao, who was very intelligent, very thoughtful about what his role at the company meant for Namibia and what it meant for him going back to China. You know, he was like many of the younger generation going to China. He had been in Xi'an, making a decent living for a young engineer, but had been sought out by a headhunter who told him that he could make 10 times the amount that he was making in China if he worked in Africa. And he jumped at the chance, as many young men in China will, in order to build a nest egg from which they can buy some property, get married, and really set themselves up for the future. And now we had very long kind of heart-to-heart talks about what this meant for his future. And he doesn't really know his daughter, he did go back and get married, and he had a daughter, and he doesn't know his daughter all that well. And they came out and tried to join him, and they didn't make it very long. But now I just talked to him after the story came out, and he said that they're going to give it another try because the livelihood that he can make in Africa is so much better than he could expect if he came back home. He says if he came back home, he would have to be begging for a job from the local kids from his little village in Shanxi province who have made a fortune out of date trees, and he would have to find a way in. He wouldn't be able to use his engineering skills to make the kind of money that he makes in Africa. But he's an example of the kind of guy who, you speak to him for a little while, and then they really, in many cases they want to open up to talk about what this means for their own lives, and they like to see themselves in the narrative of their lives fitting into the narrative of their country.
On the Namibian side, kind of how forthcoming did you find Namibian officials talking about the nitty-gritty of the China-Africa relationship, especially in the case of Namibia, because it was also going through this big scandal, of a prominent Chinese businessman and his relationship to the president. Did you hit a wall there when speaking to them, or were they relatively open about the kind of decisions they make and the negotiations they undergo with the Chinese?
I found that I found some officials quite reticent, but others extremely forthcoming. I believe that on a government, I think overall what made Namibia so interesting for me was not simply that you had these many different contact points, but also that it seems to be a relationship that's going through an evolution. It's at an inflection point where locals, both from the government down to the local communities, including the wildlife conservation community, are starting to think again about how to recalibrate their relationship with China. And I felt this in the government. I had a very interesting conversation with the finance minister, who has in the past year has kind of pulled away a little bit from the kind of just accepting of just loan tenders from China, and is kind of concerned not simply about the potential that has for adding to their debt, and debt to GDP ratio is something that they're very concerned about for macroeconomic terms, but also because it had created a culture that they felt was not necessarily healthy. There was some degree of corruption involved in some of the loan tenders, as well as the fact that Namibia, despite the fact that it's a relatively stable economy for Africa, has high degree of unemployment as well as one of the highest rates of inequality in the world. And so the finance minister was very clear that he was looking to find a new balance in the relationship that would have a greater impact on employment and on equality. And I felt that in some ways the loans and the investments that came from China were very welcome, but they were quite narrow in terms of their impact on the economy in those broader terms.
Well, let's stay I'm sorry, keep going.
Go ahead, Eric.
No, I was going to say let's stay with the finance minister, and I'd like to read a few quotes that you got, and I'm going to not pronounce the name correctly. Kalle Schlettwein, Namibia's Schlettwein. Okay. So here's a quote: "We welcome China very much because for the first time it gave us a real alternative to a Western-driven agenda, whether it was South Africa or the Western world." And I can imagine that a lot of African governments feel the same, that finally they've broken the chains of dependency on the West. The finance minister then goes on to say, but the Chinese say, we want you to be masters of your own destiny, so tell us what you want. But they have conditions too. They want de facto total control over everything. So it's difficult to bring about a situation that is truly beneficial. I have to say, when I read that quote, that is not the type of statement that you hear coming from an African finance minister very often these days. In fact, more what you see is the Rwandan finance minister, the Ugandan finance minister, Nigeria. That's just in the past 2 months, who have been to Beijing, hat in hand, asking for billions of dollars in development money. And what I'm hearing from you is that Namibia might be part of a new wave of skepticism towards the Chinese, worried that the debt levels are getting too high, and ultimately, if those debt levels get too high, sovereignty could be compromised because the Chinese, as he pointed out, want de facto total control.
That's certainly one very important aspect. I think there's another aspect of this is that from the loan tenders that have come from China have been extremely generous. Most of China loves to say that we do not interfere in the internal politics or of any country. We have no conditions on our loans. And yet what the finance minister was saying is that, yes, that's true, but they do have these conditions where most of the loans are almost de facto going to Chinese companies that then often offer their supply contracts to other Chinese companies, mostly state-owned companies, and it doesn't often break the circle. Now, in recent years, Namibia has introduced a system by which they have joint venture partners. But these the local joint venture partners that go in with the Chinese to bid on these loans are often companies that have just been formed for this express purpose and are not actually experts in the construction field or the field that they're actually bidding for. They often are just very politically connected, often with high-level government officials, relatives who form these companies, and they're seen as vehicles for further potential corruption, as well as amassing wealth in a very small percentage of hands. So I think there's they actually have gotten a name for themselves. These people, these joint ventures that help the Chinese get their loans and will then let them have a free hand in what they're doing, are called tenderpreneurs. And they're kind of looked at a bit scathingly by Namibian society. And I think there's a sense that they need to change the way this works a bit. And I don't know exactly how they'll come back to it. Many of the loans that were frozen last September by the Namibian government were ones that were considered not quite essential, like building the parliament building. They've done a lot of kind of trophy projects that they just don't want to do those trophy projects anymore. And maybe Namibia has a freer hand because its economy is in a slightly healthier state than some of these other African nations. I think that's probably is definitely true. But at the same time, it's interesting to see how they're trying to find a way that even a very small country can try to at least get some of their own conditions into the equation.
Cobus, when I hear Brooke talk about tenderpreneurs and the cycling of loan money into Chinese companies, really it reminds me of what the United States and European aid in Africa have been doing for decades. The United States is very upfront that aid is intended to be partially a support for American exporters. They don't contract locally as much because that's not politically popular back home. That is the same in France, it's the same in Germany, it's the same in UK. And again, I think what we're seeing is how the behavior of the Chinese in Africa is actually in so many ways not all that different than what we've seen with previous foreign powers in the region.
I agree. I mean, notoriously, for a while, Japan made more money from its foreign loans than it actually ever paid out because of loan repayments and interest on loan repayments. So Japan was for a few years getting more money in than it was actually like going out with its yearly aid payments. So, when I hear the word entrepreneur, I think South Africa, because I think that is actually where the word comes from. And that, it relates to a system that was set up to try and address the one of the fundamental problems of a post-colonial society, which is that the majority of the population is de-skilled, and that they have very low skills base. So it's very difficult to just say, okay, we're setting up companies to for locals to participate in these projects when there are such a low level, low skills level in the country. And in order to try and rectify that, you end up with corruption. That is what's one of the lessons from South Africa. Brooke, what I was wondering is, could you get any kind of real feeling? I know that you were only there for a while. Could you get any real feeling about whether the Chinese investments that you were seeing, did you see investments that you felt is going to materially advance Namibia along the route to becoming a richer nation? I mean, you mentioned in your article, for example, massive port expansions in Walvis Bay. Did you get a feeling that some of these debts were taken on with actual results that will actually ameliorate their effects?
I'm not sure if any of the loans themselves would, and I think the finance minister would be hard pressed actually to come up with one that he felt was a truly beneficial in the long term for Namibians. That's not to say that this infrastructure that China is building is not essential. I mean, as you know, Namibia's roads are I think the vast majority of roads are gravel, sand, or dirt. And if you go anywhere from Walvis Bay to all the way up to the border with Angola, Chinese are building roads as well as many other things all across the country. And these things are necessary. And I don't think anyone argues with the necessity of that kind of infrastructure to advance an economy. I think the frustration comes in the skills transfer. They feel like because of many of these, some of the loans are held quite tightly within a Chinese community, it's hard for the skills to transfer, especially because you don't have companies of a scale that can actually compete or can contribute in a way that would be beneficial to a broader part of the population. The one investment that is really positive and that has the biggest impact on Namibia right now is the Husab mine, which is China General Nuclear and Swakop Uranium have invested a huge amount in this mine. And I think it does have, other than tourism, it's really the only other bright spot in the Namibian economy right now. That said, there is also some reservations about how much this investment, which already is closing in on $5 billion in both the construction and the production phase, how many multiplier effects that will have for the country. I mean, the finance minister was also saying that the original deal that in which the CGN bought that mine was done outside of the country and had no real benefit. They bought it from an Australian company, and that purchase did not really have much impact on Namibia. And there's also a tax abatement which reduces the amount that they'll have to pay in taxes until they've actually recouped many of their costs. So there's some frustration even there on the very pure foreign direct investment about how much this actually has a ripple effect across the economy. So I think there's frustration, I guess, in terms of, yes, it's great to have physical things that add to your GDP and to your imports and exports and to your, the attraction of Walvis Bay and that coast as being a clearinghouse for many countries in southern Africa. All those things are good and are things that Namibia as a government wants to pursue. But I think there's some frustration with how does this actually help our people in a broader sense of skills development and employment and poverty.
Brooke, I really enjoyed the article from top to bottom. I have to say, though, that I was a little bit skeptical when I saw it first come out, and I'm going to kind of take a shot at your editors. And what a lot of people don't understand is that journalists who write the stories often don't write the headline. So this is actually not going to be a criticism of you, and I know that you're too much of a gentleman and you like your job too much to criticize your own editors, so allow me to do it. The headline is just god-awful. Is China the world's new colonial power? And it's that word colonialism that it seems like, Europeans and Americans, when they see China, or more importantly, I think Cobus would say when they see Africa, foreigners in Africa, that word is almost an automatic trigger. And what was so unfortunate about the use of that word in the headline was the comments that you can read on the New York Times website. And one of the joys of reading the New York Times is how many well-educated, thoughtful, considerate, articulate readers they have who contribute comments to every story. And here there are 334 comments in Cobus. That is, that's a volume of comments that we don't see on China-Africa stories. So it was kind of exciting. Yeah. I went right through all of them, and so many people kind of came back to this word colonialism. And let me just read one for you. T.H. Mack from Washington, D.C. wrote, "Colonial power means complete political and economic control of a foreign country. China doesn't fall into this category." 126 people liked that comment. That's representative in many ways of the kind of theme of a lot of the comments, and I feel like that headline distracted people from the kind of essence and the core message that you were trying to kind of report. So talk to me about the word colonialism and how did it factor into your own reporting? Even though it was in the headline, it didn't seem like it was a strong theme of the story.
Yes, I mean, actually, I felt I had to be very careful with that concept. I agree that it's not the definition of a colonial power. I also feel like the use of that word is so loaded that I tried to avoid it. And actually, in a section of the story where I quoted you, I tried to lay that out and say that this is often looked at as simply a binary proposition where it's either a colonial power or it's the salvation. And I felt that question itself was more misleading. And my own kind of methodology is to gauge experience on its own. I understand that there are issues of in each of these realms that I looked into. People could say, "Oh, that's the way a certain kind of power would act," but I did not want to put a definition such as that on that experience. I just wanted to have the experience speak for itself. And at the end of the day, when you finish the story, you have a feeling for the story that would give you a sense that maybe both things are true, or not quite both things are true, but that they exist in a certain kind of inextricably linked way, but that it wouldn't be something so blatant as an answer yes or no.
Well, the article is poorly titled but excellently reported. Is China I have to get that dig in there. Is China the world's new colonial power? If you have not read it, go ahead to the New York Times website at nytimes.com. Just search for China, Africa, and it'll come up. If you are following this story, this is a kind of a benchmark piece. It's an excellent piece. And one of the things that I hope is that it will inspire other news publications and journalists to take the story as seriously as the New York Times did by sending someone like Brooke to spend the amount of time and the money, of course, to report this story. And also to avoid what the kind of journalism that we've been seeing out of places like Vice with Isabel Young, the reporter who went to the DR Congo and did kind of one of the biggest piece of crap reporting that I've seen in a long time. And I'm hoping that we can finally start moving away into more nuanced reporting, which we haven't seen for a long time. So, Brooke, congratulations. Excellent piece. Really happy that you had time to join us on the show. Very quickly, what's your story that you're working on next?
I've actually just got back from Bangladesh, where I'm working on something that has to do with the Rohingya refugee crisis there. So it's not about China this time.
Wow. Okay. Well, listen, thank you so much for joining us on the show. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Eric and Cobus. Nice to be with you.
And Cobus, this idea that that the New York Times hopefully kind of inspires other journalists and journalism organizations to follow suit is something that might be in this day and age of declining budgets, might be a too big of an ask, I think.
It might be, but at the same time, this is the point that I think we've been making a lot, is that China-Africa relations end up saying a lot about the West's position in the world. And of course, that is why, kind of publications like the New York Times, among one of the reasons why they cover it. But I think it would actually be fascinating if more Western publications use the China-Africa relationship as a lens to look at the world's relationship with the West, and what the West is not doing. It might be a bit of a big ask, but we'll see. It might develop.
Well, let's hope so. That'll do it for this edition of the show. If you have any questions or any comments, we would love to hear from you. It's how Brooke got in touch with me, and we speak almost every week with 4 or 5 different people who just have questions, whether they're working on academic papers or you're journalists or you just had a question. On LinkedIn, I had a gentleman who read Brooke's article. He's 60 years old. He said that he had never heard of this story before, found me on LinkedIn, and said he's fascinated by it. So please do reach out. Cobus and I love to interact with everybody. We will give you the time of day if you ask, and so please do engage us, and we'd love to hear from you. So we'll be back again next week with another edition of the China in Africa podcast. For Cobus Van Staden, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Head over to facebook.com/China Africa Project to share your thoughts on today's show, or follow China Africa News that's updated every 4 hours, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The guys are also on Twitter, where you can find Cobus at Stadenesque or Eric at E. Olander. That's EOLANDER. Subscribe to the China Africa podcast on iTunes or download the mobile apps for iOS, Android, or Windows Phone. Just head over to your favorite store and search for China Africa.